promoting regional airports and regional transport hubs. So the maths would suggest that London is very, very important. And you use that as a gateway to enable the promotion of London to benefit the rest of the UK visitor economy.
Thank you. Historic England did advise that maybe having different sorts of heritage trails could really help lure people away from the capital, and I think the value for money that they could have, it would be cheaper to spend a portion of their holiday outside the capital. Do you think for travellers of different ages and who may have seen different perceptions of the United Kingdom, do you think sort of theme trails that we can slightly spoon feed people more into, do you think that would help promote the regions? I don't know if,
yeah, we very much know and believe and promote that heritage does draw tourism out of the capital city. It is a portal, and it certainly is a great attractor in bringing tourists to the UK. But we know that our heritage properties can help drive tourism out into all corners of the UK, and it's bringing a huge economic stimulus as well. Not only in that initial tourism spend, but also in supporting the heritage businesses and the rural communities which support and thrive on those heritage businesses. And so, yes, we do believe a heritage trail is a good way to look forward, a film map and film trail. Wearing another hat, I co-chair the Visit Hearts DMO here in Hertfordshire. Hertfordshire is the new Hollywood, we keep being told, which is delightful with the amount of development and infrastructure that's going in to bring more filming to the UK. What we've found as Knebworth when we have filming coming in is that it is bringing a lot of different areas from production here. They are flying in, the directors, the actors, but we're also utilizing many of the skills and the trades here. We also find that at Knebworth, like many other properties, we recommend local businesses, and we find that over 2/3 of what is being spent locally. So I do think that we can help drive tourism. I do think we can help spread economic development and growth. I agree very much with what Bernard was saying earlier, that it is going to take a couple of years, and we're in a very fragile point right now in supporting and retaining and keeping these businesses going.
Thank you. I know Historic Houses did say that the transport, the final mile getting to some historic properties is possibly a barrier.
Yes.
Do you think tourists need kind of a bit of help getting out of London? Do they need a spoon-feeding approach and say it's going to be really simple for you to get from A to B?
I do think that would make an enormous difference. And, you know, one of the technicians who are here today had to help this morning because he'd walked up from Knebworth Station, and that is not an easy route. It's a short route, but it's not particularly easy. And, you know, it can be a little bit intimidating as you make your way around trying to find your way. So, yes, I do think if we could help with that final mile, it would really encourage and get that springboard out of the capital into the other regions.
Thank you. And Caroline, in Yorkshire, do you feel there should be different trails maybe for travellers of different ages and interest?
Yes, I mean, it's something that we've definitely been looking at, trying to work with some of the visitor attractions in Yorkshire to bring to tourists a sense of Bridgerton was filmed here, or Creatures Great and Small, and they are all within the same region, so that you might have, for instance, a family tour which might focus on something like a secret garden, which obviously, you know, or the Railway Children Returns, which is just filmed. So trying to but very much trying to work alongside our visitor economy, not just doing it from a film perspective, because I think the tricky thing for us is tourism is not our role. We have a huge impact, and we also have a lot of expertise, which means that we can bring people who are involved in the production, for instance, to add to a quality experience for a visitor. We've been talking to Castle Howard was mentioned. We've been talking to them about maybe, you know, doing audio tours based around particular productions that have filmed there, but. Yeah, it's not our primary role, so we have to bring that expertise, but make sure that we're working with the other appropriate people to be able to assist in delivering that message.
Thank you. And Ralph, do you think we're missing a trick with a Top Gear tour of the UK?
You'd have many great locations to visit. I mean, Top Gear is a great example of showcasing, you know, every corner of the UK. We were filming in Scotland during lockdown, taking advantage of empty roads. And so, I mean, I think if you look at the rich diversity of how and where Britain is represented on screen, you'd find it's hard to find a corner that doesn't get captured by one of our programs. Countryfile, although based out of Bristol, does an incredible job of covering the span of the UK, as does programs like Antiques Roadshow. So I think actually the idea of creating guides and maps that pick up a lot of those different things and join the dots so that travellers and visitors are able to find a number of different locations, you know, that are relevant to them or familiar to them through the screen is a good idea.
And do you think we do enough data sort of gathering about the different ages of tourists that are visiting and their interests, and how do you feel we can improve on what we know about how to capitalise? I don't know, Bernard, if you...
If I can answer that, we've got really, really good data about who comes, how long they spend, and what they spend here. And if I just give you some very brief examples, again, in 2019, more people visited the V&A, the Natural History Museum, and the Science Museum in South Kent than visited Venice. And in 2019, more people visited the top 10 visitor attractions in Scotland than visited the whole of Australia and New Zealand. We're good at tourism in the UK. We're globally good. But there are things that we could be even better at. And one of them is regional spread, as has already been mentioned. Another is greater dwell time, so persuading people to stay here for longer and particularly spend their money here for longer for good reasons. And a third, and although you didn't ask the question, if I may provide an answer, and the third is to make us as compellingly attractive in contrast to our competitor countries as possible. And there are three very quick wins to do that. One is that we ought to go back to providing a duty-free incentive. So people who come here primarily for retail tourism, and they're largely from the Middle East, that actually they're coming here to the United Kingdom rather than going to Paris. And so there's a duty-free incentive. The second is that the government in the last 18 months has made a requirement that it is no longer sufficient for children and students from the EU. They have to have a passport rather than an identity card. So identity cards are no longer acceptable at customs or security. That's meant a devastating loss to language schools and to school groups coming to the United Kingdom. And the third is that we've also seen a huge loss in students going to language schools here in the UK, and we're losing market share to countries like Ireland or Malta or even the United States of America. And that's because we're not seen as particularly welcoming or incentivizing people to come here as part of their educational tours. So those are three particular things where I think we are losing market share, and that's as a direct result of relatively new political decisions.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Clive Efford.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for coming to give evidence to us today. But I was struck by the figures that you gave. They were quite stark. The drop in visitor numbers from overseas to places like St Paul's Cathedral, over 80%. I think you said it was 86% drop of overseas visitors. But how much of that is the pandemic that we've just been through, and how much of that is the impact of Brexit on London as a destination? Because, I mean, it strikes me that they both coincided and must have... is it difficult to unpick what's exactly had the biggest impact?
You're exactly right. It's very, very difficult to unpick at the moment because both happened almost simultaneously. What we do know is that in London, and these are figures from the Mayor of London's office, we lost in the region of 850,000 workers from London in 2020. And a good proportion of those, we estimate it to be between about 25 and 30%, worked in hospitality and tourism. So they either went back to their homes within the UK, or they went back to their homes somewhere in mainland continental Europe. So we've lost staff. We also know that we're in a recruitment crisis at the moment, so it's incredibly difficult to recruit particularly front of house staff, catering staff and chefs and people working in restaurants. which is why, and you've probably seen it in your constituencies as well, where restaurants and bars and pubs are often closing at lunchtime because they can't actually staff it. It's not that there's a lack of market or appetite, they just can't staff the places. So we know that there's a recruitment crisis, and that's partly Brexit, it's partly COVID, and it's partly losing those staff to also other jobs as well, which are better paid. But in terms of international visitors who are no longer coming here because of Brexit, we can't be certain that that's a significant factor, because Brexit and COVID have happened at a parallel time, and therefore it's very difficult to unpick.
Of those workers within the hospitality industry that have left the country, how many had to go because of changes to immigration rules, or how many chose to go because they no longer wanted to stay? Do you have any idea about that?
I don't, I'm afraid, but I'm sure at some point in this committee's inquiry you'll be hearing from UK Hospitality, and they would have those figures.
And in the past, there's always been concerns from the tourism industry about the ability of people to go to multiple destinations in Europe. So people coming from China who want to visit Berlin, Venice, Paris, and then come to the UK. And has that problem been exacerbated in the last 2 years by the changes in immigration?
Not particularly in the last 2 years, though it was previously. So we know from our colleagues in the United States that the most attractive dual destination package that could be sold in mainly East Coast and West Coast America is a London and Paris combination. And just the complexity of putting those two together, because of the consequences of Brexit, makes it a more complicated sell than would have been the case before 2019. So that's one that we've got particular data on, and I'm sure Visit Britain will be able to provide you with some insights into that.
And how do we compare in terms of cost with other destinations like Paris or?
Cost as a visitor experience?
Yes, to cost to the tourist, yeah.
We are not seen as a cheap destination. We're seen as a high value destination, and we're seen as an affordable destination. And I think one of the great, and this comes back to a subject that we were previously talking about, if people only see UK tourism through the lens of London prices, then they're going to be delighted and surprised when they get out of London to realise that actually the rest of the country is far more affordable. So one of the things that I think that Visit Britain will be doing, and they've just launched their international campaign in the United States and in 6 European countries last week, is to tell the story of the diversity of Britain. And that's as much about diversity of geography and people and aspects and stories and history and contemporary art, as well as heritage. But they'll also be telling the story of affordability as well.
And Caroline, can I just ask you about sport tourism? Because I remember Gary Verity and the tour when he won the Tour de France, the UK leg of the Tour de France, from under the nose of the government, who was promoting a different option. Did that have a lasting impact for Yorkshire in terms of, because it's such a massive sporting event?
In all honesty, I don't think it did. I don't think it did. I mean, I think it was it certainly put the spotlight on Yorkshire, and people came to see the race. And probably for a short amount of time, I mean, you know, obviously all the hotels were booked up and the restaurants were full. But in terms of long-term impact, no, I wouldn't say so.
And is that because it's a sporting event, or is that because no effort was made to capitalise on it? What?
I think.
I mean, we hear that Brideshead's still having an impact 25 years later.
Yes,
but
and
Tour de France is not.
Yes, and Castle Howard is still there, and that's why I think. So, I mean, you know, once the bikes are gone, what's left? It's the roads
Yorkshire,
that it's the roads. I think so. I think in terms of actually a campaign to kind of sell the rest of Yorkshire around the Tour de Yorkshire leg, I don't think that really happened, and if it had done, maybe there would have been a longer lasting impact, but no, I don't think it did.
Yeah, so I'm a Greenwich borough MP, and I remember the bid for the 2012 Olympics very well. And one of the things that we were most interested in and determined to achieve was promoting our area and getting inward investment into our area and promoting among other things, tourism. And I mean, we think that worked very successfully. Would you have an assessment of that, how a big sporting event like that has an impact on promoting Britain?
Yes, and you're absolutely right. I mean, you only need to think back to 2012, which is only 10 years ago, but it feels like a very long time ago. You only need to think back to the Olympics.
It was 2005 we won it.
Yeah, but to think of the dressage, for example, in front of the Queen's House at the National Maritime Museum, and the images that went out around the world. And you'll know this better than I, but I think the very fact of winning the games and then hosting them so successfully, in particular in Greenwich, did two things. One was the amount of overseas visitors who now as in up to 2019, who now come to Greenwich has quadrupled, easily quadrupled. So now the Royal Museums Greenwich, which is the National Maritime Museum, the Royal Observatory, the Queen's House and the Cutty Sark, in 2019 they would have got something like 67% of their visitors from overseas. Now that's in stark contrast from just 10 years prior to that. The other is that it kick-started, and again, you'll know better than I, but it kick-started the creation of Visit Greenwich and DMO and significant funding from the local authority into tourism promotion. And of course now, when normality resumes, also cruise tourism coming into Greenwich as well. So I think all of that can be attributed back to the confidence and investment and the profile of Greenwich during the 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just to drill down, Mr. Donoghue, when you said before about how a visitor from, say, the East Coast of the United States would normally book a sort of London-Paris joint package, what, as a result of Brexit, has precisely changed for the experience of that particular traveller, considering they come from the United States?
Only simply that tour operators now find it slightly more difficult to construct that package. So if you're a tour operator in the United Kingdom, constructing a package which includes a hotel in Paris and accommodation and travel and accommodation in the United Kingdom, it's now slightly more complicated to put that package together than it would have been 3 years ago. And
I don't understand how. I don't understand how. Because you're buying from, presumably you're buying from a French hotelier company or international one, and you're buying a British hotel company, you're buying your flights, you buy Eurostar. The points of entry are exactly the same as they would have been prior to Brexit. Is not the real reason for this difficulty more to do with COVID and to do with, for example, President Macron and his rather changing almost every day in terms of if you come from the UK, you know, the ridiculousness of 4-month vaccination policy that we've seen? Is that not more about uncertainty than it is specifically about Brexit?
Well, it's still very difficult to understand what things are attributable to Brexit and what things are attributable to COVID. But what we do know is that in research that Visit Britain has undertaken around the world, when people do want to come back, the United Kingdom is top of their list to come to. And that's why Visit Britain have just put out a campaign in the United States and from memory, France, Germany, Netherlands, Spain and Italy this week in order to attract people back to the United Kingdom. And separately, the London Tourism Recovery Board, which I co-chair with Kate Nichols of UK Hospitality, will be doing a London-specific campaign in France and Germany and the United States in order to get people back to the United Kingdom. But of course, the success...
But a US citizen is not going to feel, oh, I'm going to travel to Britain because of Brexit. I mean, a French and German citizen may have certain misgivings as a result of that. But I can't see any way in which that someone living in New York wishing to book a London-Paris trip will go, okay, well, I'm not going to do that because of Brexit. They may do it because, frankly, if I go to London and try and go to Paris, Macron's going to stop me from going unless I can show a vaccination or something like that. It does seem to be, I mean, forgive me, Mr. Donoghue, I mean, I've dealt with UK hospitality quite a few times, particularly in the run-up to Brexit. It does seem to me still as if the industry has this sort of want to desire in order basically to sort of pin quite a lot on Brexit itself, rather than actually look at other aspects and try and actually adapt to the ever-changing world and our new reality?
Yes, I mean, I'll simply repeat, as I did to Mr. Efford, that actually it's incredibly difficult to unpick what things are attributable to Brexit and what things are attributable to COVID, because they happened at exactly the same time. And we're still unpicking, and in many cases, helping the survival of tourism businesses. But I do go back to a statement that I made right at the beginning, which is the success of inbound tourism to the UK is predicated on the successful rollout of vaccination programs of other countries. So we may be the first to reopen, but if other countries are not ready to go out from their own countries and to come here, then we're in a difficult situation.
Thank you. Giles Watling.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you everybody for coming today. Well, some of us live here, but really good to see you. Thank you. So you said we're good, Bernard. We're very good, but we're starting from scratch again, aren't we, really? Because COVID knocked everything on the head, international travel. We are a world leader in tourism, and we have been for many, many years. What can we do that's new now? Or how can the government help us get back to where we were before?
We're not entirely starting from scratch, which, being in a place that was built in 1490, must come as some relief, I would have thought, because we have our reputation, because we're front of mind around the world for being a welcoming destination. But one of the things that we've also learnt in tourism, and you'll forgive me, but I've been appearing in front of this committee and predecessor committees since 1997. And one of the things that I'm very aware of is that this committee in particular understands the importance of tourism all year round, every year, in a way that perhaps governments haven't. Governments tend to only really appreciate tourism at times of crisis. And whether that's 20 years ago with foot and mouth disease, or during economic recession, or at times of crisis, or now. I'm delighted to say that tourism is absolutely front of mind, both of DCMS ministers and also Treasury and Number 10 ministers as well, as evidenced by things like the Cultural Recovery Fund, which has enabled tourism businesses and those in the cultural sector not just to survive the last 2 years, but actually build their foundations in order to thrive. And I don't think that government would have done that. We were the sector that received the largest single amount of money from the Exchequer across the whole of the economy. I don't think government would have done that had they not appreciated the true importance of tourism. There are things, however, that could be done better or more or differently. I've already mentioned duty-free. And accepting ID cards from EU children, because we've lost that children and language market. Yeah. I think one of the things that we could also do, and it was hugely appreciated by from this sector, from the Chancellor, is the reduction in VAT from 20% down to 5% for accommodation and visitor attraction businesses. That was, it's something that we've been arguing for a number of years, but it was an absolute lifeline, ensuring that those businesses saw their way through the pandemic. As you know, it's now gone back up to 12.5% and is due to go up to 20% on the 1st of April. We think there are really, really compelling reasons why it should remain at 12.5% in order to help tourism businesses, and particularly in the accommodation sector and visitor attractions, to repair their balance sheets, to build up their finances, and to weather what will still be a tricky storm of a year this year. So those would just be a couple that I'd recommend.
Right, so you think we need to ease more into the recovery.
Yes.
The Cultural Recovery Fund did what it did. Was there, I mean, you mentioned earlier staffing being a major issue, I should imagine. And I know from experience and people I know that there's been talent drain. Because COVID hit, people went and did something else for a living, something they could do through a computer screen, a laptop at home. So is it difficult getting those people back into the sector? And I know from experience in theatre, we lost many of the freelancers who went off and did something else and now finding they're making a living. Is that an issue? And how would you address that?
It certainly is an issue. So I think there are three particular things. One is the market has changed. and we're unable to pay the same kind of salaries and wages that other sectors can. Second is that there has been a drain out of the country, let alone out of the sector. And I think the third is that we've also seen a recruitment crisis right the way across the entire economy, and therefore companies and businesses are now looking again in a more savvy way about the entirety of the work package and not just the salary. So, for example, in my sector, so museums and galleries and heritage organisations and the cultural sector, more and more employees are thinking, well, if we can't give a 5 or 10% pay increase, we could perhaps think more creatively and give 5% more holiday entitlement. Mm-hmm. And so looking at the whole of the package rather than salary entitlement in just that area. But you're right. I mean, and again, one of the things that I think could very usefully be done by government could be encouraging people while still at school to think about hospitality and tourism as a lifelong career, not just something to do before you go to university or in the summer vacation.
Right. And Martha, have you here experienced that sort of issue over staffing?
We absolutely have, and I've seen that across the breadth of our membership within the Historic House Association. We represent over 1,500 privately owned and managed heritage houses, and we've all struggled with employment right across the country. And that ranges from getting help within the kitchen for a chef and a sous chef, to sales, to gardening, particularly with high skills trades, and trying to find individuals who have experience in lime render, as an example, or heritage woodwork, is very difficult. As you say, many have left the country, partly with Brexit. Others have found other employment. But it is vital that we find a stimulus to encourage people to enter into these trades, as Bernard said, as a life career, not just as a summer job.
I understand that, but what are you doing to encourage people back?
We are trying very hard with apprenticeships. We're working very hard with the government, the Kickstart scheme that Historic England helped us with, and trying to get that initiative moving. All of us believe in lifelong learning. We are encouraging folks to learn new skills and to hire locally to ensure that we've got that skill base within our region to help us with the properties. We would love to have more support to enable that to happen. We think that it could happen if we were able to keep VAT at a lower rate, both for hospitality, but also for VAT. One of your colleagues mentioned about Brexit, what are the changes? Well, we have this opportunity now to look at VAT on structural repairs of listed buildings. Yep. That would enable us to hire more people.
Right, that's a good point, and I think we can take that away with us. Just moving quickly on to attracting people via film. I mean, we all remember the opening of The Big Sleep. I think it was the 1978 movie with Robert Mitchum. He came up the A1 and came off around where the hotel is on the corner there, and eventually arrived at Knebworth, and what a great sell that is. How do we attract more? Are our tax breaks doing enough? I think this one's probably for Caroline. We've got tax breaks. We want filmmakers to come here. I mean, yes, we want to create content here, and we are great at that and exporting around the world, but we want other filmmakers to come here. Looking at it from your point of view, do you think we're doing enough to encourage that sort of activity?
I mean, I think the tax breaks are essential and really appreciated and valued, and they do obviously drive production from within the UK, as well as production to locate in the UK as well. I think there could perhaps be, obviously I'm going to say this from a regional perspective, a consideration for driving production to happen outside of London. Obviously most production is based in the southeast. We are seeing more and more of it moving outside of London because there has been a perception that London is full. London really is full. In fact, the whole of the UK is full, and we are very much like the hospitality trade, I'm sure Ralph would agree with me, really experiencing a skills crisis in our sector, a massive skills crisis, not only in terms of new entrants, but in terms of people stepping up to to those mid to higher level positions. So I think that there's definitely a skills piece that needs to be looked at if we are going to retain what is one of our real USPs, which is the quality of what we produce. And you can only produce quality if you have a really skilled workforce. And I think we are in danger of falling short on that front.
But I would say that that's why so many foreign filmmakers come to this country, because of our skills base, of our studios.
Absolutely.
But are film schools not producing the talent then anymore?
I think there's just been such a boom in production post-pandemic, and with the streamers obviously, you know, coming in with quite deep pockets and there's just such an appetite for content. I mean, it's just content production. There's just such an appetite for it, and so many channels and so many platforms and so much space to be filled that it's hard for the industry to keep up. And there's been certain areas, I think, where we've perhaps been alerted or warned that we might have shortages coming, but I don't think anybody would ever have anticipated the levels of production that we're at now. I don't know whether you would...
And we've just got to make sure we get our slice of the pie. Yes, Ralph?
I would absolutely confirm what Caroline says, but I'd say the skills shortage that we're experiencing is very different to the one that's being experienced in the tourism industry. This is a skills shortage that's a result of growth, as opposed to, you know, a flight of talent. The film schools and screen skills and big organisations like the BBC are doing a massive amount to train people. We're bringing in more apprentices, you know, more schemes in which to bring people into the industry. And we're using at BBC Studios in particular the scale and breadth that we've got, the continuing dramas that we've got, to really kind of bring new talent in, train them on those nursery sloped shows so that they grow into those bigger upscale shows. I agree with Caroline that the tax breaks are essential. They've been an absolutely key part of attracting particularly the money from Netflix, Amazon, Disney and Apple into the UK. And as a result, our studios are full. Our production order book is full for high-end drama in particular in the UK. Some dramas that we wanted to mount in South Wales, which is a very big hotspot for film and drama, we actually couldn't mount because they were quite a small scale and we couldn't find the skills to do them. We had to postpone the filming of one relatively low-scale comedy in order to, you know, wait for the skills to be available. But I think the industry will catch up. It's difficult to know how this will smooth out. There was a big boom in filming last summer as a result of dramas that should have been shot in the summer of 2019 and 2020 that were pushed back into 2021. And so last summer in particular was a real pinch point, a real bottleneck.
And you lead me to my very final point, if I may. This is quite simply a large organisation like the BBC used to, for instance, have its director's course, which I think was abandoned in about 1990, thereabouts. Should the BBC and organisations like that reopen that in order to build that skills gap?
We've got a number of different skills courses, whether at the moment we've got a fantastic assistant producer scheme, which I've funded for the last 2 years. We're bringing in, as I say, apprentices into lots of different skills. We fund different writer schemes. So we put together different skills and training courses to meet the immediate needs of production. So although the one that you refer to about directors might not currently be running, if we think that that's what we need in order to get through a bottleneck of skills, then we'll invest in it. We're investing a huge amount in skills.
Good to hear. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Simon Job.
Thank you, Chair. As we know, the last 2 years, COVID has really hit the sector really, really hard, a whole load of different sectors and parts of our economy. We know there was government support, temporary tax cuts, grants, loans, the furlough scheme and the Cultural Recovery Fund that was already mentioned. I just want to know from all of you how far this support went to help save the industry, to mean that we can talk about the future of the industry here today, despite the difficulties we face, and we'll touch on what those are in a moment. If I can come to Martha first, if that's all right.
Yes, thank you very much. We were very grateful for the support that came forward, and it came forward in many different ways. We've touched on the reduction of VAT on hospitality, and that really did make a huge difference in the retention of some of the hospitality business. It was not possible for a kickstart of all business. As you can imagine, in a barn like this, we would normally host weddings, we would host large conferences. None of that business came back as quickly as one would have hoped, and it's still trickling through. So having the opportunity to participate, to apply with the Cultural Recovery Fund made all the world's difference to many of our members. As you can imagine, historic buildings deteriorate. That is just what they do. When you have a situation like the pandemic and our entire sales projection was pulled out from under our feet, and you lost all ability to manage and restore these properties, that deterioration continued. To have the opportunity to apply, which it made all the difference in the world because these cracks were getting ever bigger, subsidence was increasing, roofs were failing and collapsing. And when that happens, it of course affects not just the building, but the collections within them, also the employment of the folks who work in those locations, and the businesses which rely on that heritage properties business, all of the suppliers and secondary spend. We've got a backlog of over 1.34 billion pounds of restoration across our member properties. We spend on average £80,000 a year trying to stay on top of them. When we've lost our business and any sales that could come forward, that comes to a grinding halt but continues to get worse. So how do we try to get better? If there were more opportunities like that where we can show that we can bring something in on budget, on time, and bring greater benefit to the broader community, we would welcome that immensely. If there were further opportunities with the VAT to stay down at 12.5%, that in turn would increase expenditure locally, it would increase economic stimulus and retain jobs and keep businesses open. Again, if there were the opportunity to relook at VAT on structural repairs, that would make a massive difference. And we feel very strongly that the payback for that would come forward very quickly. So there are a few ways that we think we can see further improvement, but we would very much like to put those asks forward on the table.
I hear those answers loud and clear. Same question to you, reflecting on the last 2 years, the level of government support that's been there. How much has that helped you and your members survive this in an unprecedented time?
Totally. I've been working in tourism now since 1997, and I haven't seen this level of active creative support from a government for the tourism sector ever. Of course, we live in unprecedented times, and the pandemic was completely extraordinary. But I think it would be utterly true to say that DCMS and Treasury, and indeed Number 10, have shown that they've understood tourism in the last 2 years in a way that previous governments haven't. And I think one of the reasons for that is that a number of reasons. The first is that we've had the huge benefit of a passionate and tireless tourism minister in Nigel Huddleston, who was appointed immediately prior to pandemic and has inherited all of this. I sit on the government's Tourism Industry Council, so speak with him very regularly. He's been an tireless advocate and enthusiast for tourism. That's helped enormously. The professionalism of the DCMS civil servants in creating very creative, extraordinary packages of support has been absolutely phenomenal. And I think the third is that government has understood, in a way that we understand, that tourism and culture isn't just where you grow jobs, though we're very good at it. It's also where you grow people. And it's where you grow people in terms of their cultural literacy or their curiosity around the world, or their interdependence or their knowledge of communities and history and heritage. And I think government have completely understood that. There are some pockets where we would have required additional support, and I think some still needs to be forthcoming. Firstly, and it was an area that Mr. Watling identified, which is freelancers in the cultural sector. They've fallen through the net. Second is the transport sector, so in particular minibuses and bus companies and tour operators have largely fallen through the net. And largely those inbound tour operators whose entire market, whose entire income has just disappeared in the last 2 years, they're very vulnerable too. So those would be the three particular pockets that I think still require additional support, but that does need to be seen in the context of an extraordinary level of political and financial investment into this sector, which, as I say, has been unprecedented and for which we're enormously grateful.
Do you think they were facing a perfect storm, potentially? All that money that's been spent, all that taxpayers' money that's been spent propping up the industry necessarily over the last 2 years could be wasted because of in some cases, because of the different things that are coming along. So the costs of staffing going up via tax increases, the confidence domestically, internationally, not quite where it could be. We're still obviously excluding some people from travelling. Other countries haven't got the vaccination programs that we have over here. Do you think that actually this sector is more in danger now, as we seem to be recovering and coming out of COVID, than it was at the start of the pandemic when you're receiving all this support?
Well, I certainly don't think that any of that money has been wasted. And in fact, the very survival of the greatest tenets, the foundation and building blocks of our tourism product, our tourism offer around the world, have been saved, and that's no mean achievement. As I said in answer to a previous question, I do think there's a danger of double jeopardy this year, which is a domestic market who now wants to travel abroad, and a inbound market which won't be coming here this year in the levels that we had to 2019. So I think this year will be a potentially financially challenging market for UK tourism, with a depressed staycation market and a depressed inbound market. And therefore I think the levels of support that should be retained, like a lower level of VAT for tourism, hospitality and the attraction sector, is vital to get people through what will still be a challenging year this year.
Caroline, is there anything you want to add on that point, from your point of view?
Really only just to echo what Bernard was saying about the freelance community. I think they were very hard hit within our sector, and I think the message that sends about the instability of careers within the screen industries to young people who we are actively trying to encourage to enter careers in the screen industries because of the skill shortages is quite a problem, and one that we are definitely seeing in our dialogue with universities and colleges and schools now.
I'm going to stop being a doom monger for my last question, if that's all right, and just talk about innovation. Ralph, you mentioned in a response to a previous question from my colleague next to me, Giles, about how some productions have been stalled for a year because of the need because of the pandemic. What innovation has COVID driven within BBC Studios?
It's actually been quite remarkable to see how producers have adapted to the restraint and the constraints of COVID, whether that's Gardener's World putting a kind of fixed rig into the garden so that they don't need to have cameramen moving around, whether it's, we shot Springwatch using a completely different technology than we did before, which allowed us to kind of transmit the images via the internet rather than via, the traditional way. We've managed to make production faster and lighter with fewer people in order to avoid bringing two big cohorts of people together. So on many different levels, we've learnt quite a lot during COVID about how we can make production lighter, faster, more efficient. I think at a deeper level, we are known in the UK for being tirelessly innovative in programme making, and that's a huge advantage to us. It's a massive export. I talked about the Natural History unit in Bristol, and they're really a technology company. Do you know what I mean? What they really do is innovate at the heart camera technology that allows us to film with helicopters in a way that's never been used before, or film in deep water or low light or at night in ways that have never been done before. So I think innovation is terribly important, and innovation in storytelling as well, which is a lot behind what we talk about in terms of how we capture the story of the UK, and that's about supporting great writers and supporting the diversity of writers that Caroline talked about, the diversity of voices that come to the screen. So a lot of our work is about how we capture those different voices and make sure that a lot of people from different backgrounds are finding a voice within the industry.
Thank you, Ralph. Martha, how do you innovate historic buildings like this?
I'm really delighted to add to that. I was longing to do so. We're very much a group of entrepreneurs within the Historic House Association, and engagement and storytelling is what we excel in. And the pandemic really put a halt to it and made it very difficult. But we're not a breed that stops. We always look for ways to engage and to find another way to share those stories. And so doing so digitally was something that we found with our members was highly innovative, from virtual tours to digitizing archives, to creating online resource for education, because a lot of education had to happen from home, and heritage is part of the national curriculum. So we were trying to find ways to continue to engage both domestically but also internationally. And you look at an example of Highclere Castle, where Downton, which we've mentioned, has been filmed, or here, where we've had many episodes and series of The Crown filmed, and other productions. That brings it back into one's living room and gives you that opportunity to engage. It puts the seed of the idea to travel forward in the future when you're able to do so, and hopefully then to bring that economic stimulus forward when that opportunity happens. You asked as well about innovation, other forms. When we saw the easement of permitted development rights, that really helped our members. When we weren't able to open our beautiful big buildings and our homes for touring, but we could have outside experiences, that really made a big difference to us. And, you know, there's a property, Arley Hall in Cheshire, who hosted a Harry Potter exhibit. They were using that permitted development right extension to have an outside marquee experience so that the visitors could still come in and have that heritage and that experience available to them. We were able to have a pop-up shop. We had drive-in cinema, a drive-in pub, and a drive-in show. The folks who came to work at those events had not worked for a year, you know, picking up on the freelancers. Their opportunities had just disappeared. But looking for an entrepreneurial spirit, trying to come up with a way to think outside of the box so that you can still survive, you can still retain that employment, is something that we do extremely well.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Damien Green.
Thank you, Chair. And good afternoon now, everyone. Just as an aside at the start, we've accepted that Brideshead was 25 years ago. At this end of the table, we think it was 40 years ago. It's even more remarkable that Castle Howard is still benefiting from it. It's more than a generation since that TV show was made and shown. But I wanted to start by lowering the tone. We've talked a lot about high culture and in terms of media or historic houses and so on. But I want to talk about shopping. How important is retail as part of this successful industry? In percentage, Bernard, you?
Huge. We know from Visit Britain research around the world that the number one motivating factor to come to the UK, regardless of country or gender or age, is history and heritage and culture. But number 2, 3 and 4 is a complete mix. So from retail to pop to culture to sport and all over the place. But number 1 is history and heritage. Which is why we promote it rightly so well, and why, to Martha's point, heritage in aspic is not attractive. Heritage which creates and is dynamic and evolves is, and that's what you see through television. In terms of retail tourism, it's enormously important. I mean, it goes back to the point that I was making about duty-free. We know that the New West End Company, for example, which is the destination management organisation which represents Oxford Street, Regent Street and that surrounding area, in a normal year, about 65 to 70% of all of the spend in the high-end retail stores are from overseas visitors, and principally from China and Gulf states. We've lost that, obviously, over the course of the last 2 years because of the pandemic. Over the course of the last 2 years, we've also lost that duty-free decision as well, so we can't use that as a tool to get people coming back. So, and retail isn't, of course, just confined to London. Actually, all of the big cities see retail tourism as one of the biggest and most important things that they do, including Manchester, Edinburgh and Glasgow in particular, where significant investment has gone in from their respective city councils into retail tourism promotion, both domestically but also internationally as well.
Yeah, and not just big cities, I should say. As my constituency, Ashford in Kent, we've got a McArthur shopping outlet, and you know, they have figures from some of their other outlets around the country where pre-pandemic, the average Chinese visitor spend was about £5,000 per visit. I mean, just extraordinary figures. That's clearly a hugely lucrative markets. But when you've talked a couple of times about duty-free and how that's important. Are you specifically talking about the VAT retail export scheme or more widely? It's that scheme,
VAT,
is it?
yeah.
You'd like to see that restored, basically.
Yes, absolutely. And you're particularly right about blue water. And of course, one of the more obvious casualties of the last 2 years has been Bicester Village. So Bicester Village, just outside Bicester, in a normal year, probably about 90% of customers there would be from overseas, and a huge proportion of those would be from China. And in fact, one of the startling facts that the committee may not be aware of is that Bicester Village, which is a retail outlet park, high-end, is probably one of the top 4 most visited destinations in the UK by Chinese visitors.
Yeah.
And has really suffered in the last 2 years.
Yeah. And I mean, looking more widely at taxation, and the chairman's mentioned Brexit a bit, and the government set up a whole department to look at Brexit opportunities, one of which is clearly a sort of freedom about taxation, apart from the retail aspect you talked about. Are there any other tax changes that you think we're now capable of doing? Clearly that's the big one, that could be directly applied to the tourism sector that would make a distinct difference.
I think the two most significant ones, the ones that would have the greatest long-term benefit to this particular sector, would be retaining a reduced level of VAT for accommodation and visitor attractions, and the second, which is a tax, is looking afresh at business rates, because business rates are currently crippling a lot of high streets, but development in high streets, but also people within the hospitality sector. So I think it would be those two, which of all the fiscal solutions that there might be, would provide the greatest benefit to our long-term survival.
Is there anything specific in terms of historic houses that you'd like to see?
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to mention Heritage Maintenance Funds, which was an initiative put forward many years ago and had some initial success, but the taxation has changed on it, and it is now taxed at the highest income tax rate as opposed to the 20% rate that it originally was. We feel very strongly that if that vehicle were able to be utilized with a lower tax band, that it would invigorate expenditure, it would invigorate employment, it would create a net benefit. We feel after just only 5 years of £85.5 million to the UK economy, and based on that, if you look at the tax that would be derived, it would increase revenue by over £4 million in that same period. It's not available to many private owners to use effectively, and I think if it were, it would be.
Okay, thanks. While I'm going through people's wish lists, in the media sector, film or TV, is there anything you think they could do that it wouldn't be too expensive, it's not wildly out of kilter, that they're not already doing? You've mentioned, Ralph, the tax advantages you do get.
I think that just principally that the tax advantages for high-end drama, the high-end drama tax break is really, really important to us. I don't have any other specific asks around tax.
Okay. Caroline, anything?
No, I would say the same. I think it's about making sure that we don't lose the tax breaks that are available to us, and that we really utilise those in terms of encouraging the development of IP value within the UK, not that we just become a service industry for productions wanting to base themselves here, that tax break is genuinely available to and exploited by those who are bringing and retaining value within the country.
That's an interesting development, isn't it? Because it would be easy to see the sort of Wimbledonisation of media, where it happens in Britain, but actually all the benefit goes overseas. As an equivalent of, we don't win it very often, but it's great that it happens here. it would be the same sort of thing if our studios went that way.
I think that is a genuine concern, that we don't want to just become a production services company without, you know, really building where the value is, which is in the IP developed from the UK and retained in the UK.
And ultimately, sorry if I can just jump in, that comes down to the retained strength of our public service broadcasting system and the terms of trade under which all producers, BBC Studios, I operate with the BBC as a commissioner on a level playing field with all other producers, and the terms of trade that allow the producer to retain the IP that operate within our public service broadcasting system are really, really important to us.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Kevin Brennan?
On that point about retaining IP, would it be sensible then to tweak the high-end TV tax breaks and film tax breaks to ensure that you couldn't actually get the full tax break unless you promised that IP could be retained within the UK? I mean, you mentioned Michaela Cole earlier on. Of course, she came to the BBC with I May Destroy You because others, like Netflix, wouldn't allow people to keep their IP.
Yeah,
So wouldn't that be a useful way of trying to retain IP?
I think you've got to balance out the kind of potential chilling effect that would have on the inward investment, because the industry has definitely benefited from the attraction to the UK as a skills base, and great writing, great performing, great acting, great skills to make your drama, and it's brought in the attraction of the streamers.
Would it be? I understand that point. Would it be sensible to tweak it to allow a slightly higher tax break for smaller sized productions, you know, the up to sort of £10 million UK-based sort of film, to give more of an incentive for that kind of production in terms of retaining IP and retaining British stories out there that we sell to the world?
If it was boosting the attractiveness of making things at a different tariff and you know, for retained IP, then that could be attractive. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think, Caroline?
I would definitely agree with that. I think the film sector in particular has been, you know, more hard hit than the television sector, because obviously cinemas have been closed. I think our independent film industry is really challenged at the moment, and that challenge has only been increased by the rates that people are, you know, now paying for crew, and so in order to allow those smaller productions to compete or be able to actually secure crew, especially at a time where people are having to work within COVID protocols as well, which add to the budget. I think anything that can be done to help support that would be very valuable indeed.
On the skills issue that you were mentioning earlier within the film and television sector, what particular skills are the ones that there are the greatest shortages in?
I mean, it does vary a little bit from region to region, but I would say the ones that are sort of on a UK-wide basis we're hearing about, production accountancy. I think that's one that's been a challenge for I mean, that's not just post-COVID related. I think that's been an issue across the industry for a while. People in production, we're experiencing a real shortage around art department at the moment. So production accountancy, and art department and locations, I think, is the other area. I don't know whether, Ralph, that concurs with what you're seeing.
Yeah, the basic craft skills of making drama are the ones that are under most pressure. Location managers, specific production-specific designers make up all of those ones.
Is there anything within the skills system that is problematic, and the apprenticeship system that's problematic in particular for the film and television industry?
The apprentice system is usable by a big organisation like the BBC, but the time frames that are required to bring in apprenticeships under the government scheme don't synchronise naturally with production schedules, which is a freelance market where people are brought in for a number of specific months to work on particular productions. So having an apprentice for 2 years for a small drama production company or for a factual production company is quite difficult.
So is it fit for purpose for your industry?
It doesn't work perfectly for the industry, and it's easier to utilise if you're a big organisation like the BBC than it is for the film and television industry, which is overall made up of a lot of small and medium-sized.
And I see you're nodding, Caroline, so just for the record, would you agree with what Ralph said?
Yes, I would absolutely agree. I mean, obviously, we're looking towards flexi apprenticeships now, and we'll you know, time will tell whether they allow apprenticeships to be more fit for purpose. But at the moment, you know, when you have an industry which is so reliant on freelancers and you know, expands and contracts its workforce, you know, on a week by week basis, let alone a month by month basis, it's really not a good.
So
fit.
it's not fit for purpose. It just needs to be tweaked to be more flexible, to be able to take into account the structure of the industry. Basically, is that fair to say?
Yes, and I
without putting
know
words in your
Screen
mouth?
Skills have been doing work around that area to see what can be done to make that work. I mean, I think
Persuade
it's
the government to change it.
widely recognised that it is problematic
Okay.
for us to make it work.
Can I, Bernard, you mentioned a series of tax things earlier on when Damien Green asked you some questions. I was racking my brain while you were speaking. I couldn't think of any of those that couldn't have been done prior to Brexit. Am I right?
Reducing the rate of VAT on attractions and hospitality, I'm not sure could have been done prior to Brexit.
I think you could. Yeah, I think you could vary the rate. Anyway, but
In which case I
it was
stand
an easy
corrected.
fact to check, isn't it? Yeah. But I mean, VAT has varied quite considerably, you know, during the course of the last 50 years or so for various reasons, including the introduction of the council tax, etc.
Actually, you're right. Governments prior to Brexit could have reduced VAT on accommodation and attractions because I've had countless meetings
I think
with
I was
Treasury
lobbied on it for
ministers
many years
over a
prior to
long
Brexit,
period of time.
yeah.
So you're absolutely right.
Yep. Can I just press you, Bernard, on what you were talking about school visits earlier on? In fact, maybe I could ask Martha first. Is this the kind of place that would have got visits from school parties and so on from France and continental Europe?
We at Knebworth enjoyed, I would say pre-pandemic, around 7,000 school children during the open season, which is spring through September. Across the board, I would see more international students visiting places like Leeds Castle, Hever Castle, for the obvious geographic closeness to them. It definitely appeals. But it's how one can best recreate and stimulate that market.
Okay.
The visas, I think, are an issue, and we've talked a little bit about that previously, but visas to the UK are more difficult than the European ones.
Yeah, I want to come back to that because many years ago, when I was a member of the local authority in Cardiff, I was actually in charge of Cardiff Castle, which is owned by the council, and one of the biggest sources of income, particularly during half terms and so on, were school children visiting from continental Europe. You mentioned earlier, Bernard, that there's been have you got any data on what the effect has been of this change in requirement for passports rather than ID cards?
I don't to hand, but I can certainly provide committee with evidence afterwards. I mean, those areas that have been most affected include places like Leeds Castle, Canterbury Cathedral, Dover, English heritage properties, so sort of Pas-de-Calais, Kent areas have particularly lost out on school trips from Normandy and northwest France, and that's been particularly acute since about September of last year. But Visit Kent, which is the destination management organisation for Kent, and Visit Britain will be able to provide those details.
Because as I understand it, really, the only reason for this is pig-headed Lord Frost-style Brexit dogma, isn't it? Because the only reason the government are insisting that these school children, who are hardly going to abscond and start taking British jobs from people, have to carry a passport rather than an ID card, because they aren't to be treated any differently from any school child visiting from some other part of the world, in order to make sure that Brexit makes a difference. That's the truth, isn't it, for why this has been done?
Well, it's certainly the case that when we have raised this consistently with the Home Office has said, and in these explicit terms, that this is what the British population voted for.
Yeah, yes, I remember on the side of the bus. No more French school children on the side of the coach. Or maybe I've misremembered what that was all about. So it is basically Home Office, pig-headed Brexit stupidity, isn't it, and dogma.
And what's particularly unfortunate is that we know of a number of cases of French schools who say that if one of their children in one of their classes doesn't have a passport, then none of that class can go on a trip to Kent, for example, because they've got the whole of the EU to travel around with an ID card.
And it's also would be discriminatory towards that child if they insisted upon that. And that I would have done the same when I was a school teacher. If a child couldn't afford to come on a trip, we made sure they were able to come. And we'd never exclude anybody, for that reason. Can I just ask, finally, about this whole inquiry that we're doing is about selling Britain abroad. Does the whole issue of net zero, actually constitute an existential threat to this whole business, ultimately?
Net zero in terms of sustainable development and climate change. It's a really good question, and everyone within the tourism industry, not just here in the UK but around the world, is I think asking themselves three questions. One is, how can we be environmentally and financially sustainable? Secondly, how do we operate in a green and sustainable and ideally a climate net zero way, but also encourage our customers and visitors to do the same too? So I give as an example, I chair the National Trust's regional board for London and the South East, and we're looking at what our carbon impact is, not just of running our properties, but also of the carbon impact of our visitors who very often, this comes back to Jane Stevenson's point about the last mile, who very often have to drive to National Trust and heritage properties because they're not serviced by public transport. And so how do we help people do that? And then the last point is, it is the case that flying at the rates that the world did in 2019 is not environmentally sustainable unless the carbon impact can be massively reduced. So the entire sector is talking about this as an existential threat to its existence. But being the resilient and creative and thoughtful sector that we are, we're trying to come up with creative solutions to that rather than assume that this is going to be the end of what would otherwise be the UK's fifth biggest industry.
Okay, thank you. Can I just finally ask Martha, slightly sort of off-piste question away, but what do you make as the head of the Historic Houses Association of the whole debate, the whole woke debate about contextualising these buildings that you and your members run in terms of their actual history? What do you make of ministers telling people what they should or shouldn't say about how houses were financed, built, and what the history is?
Well, we are an association representing over 1,500 independent houses and gardens. And so we very much try to support our members and offer them information and to try to direct them where they might need to if they need further expertise. We support the government's initiative to retain and explain. As we've mentioned already, history is living history in these properties. We still live at Knebworth House and are the 19th generation to do so. And so history evolves and it needs to be interpreted, it needs to be shared, and we like to see engagement. And that is what we try to support our members in ensuring that they're able to do that.
Do you think most of what ministers say about all this is a bit silly, though?
I think it's an interesting situation in that it is enabling more dialogue, it's enabling more engagement, and I think it's important that it is discussed. And so in this day and age that we're in now, and working as we have been for the last 18 months, 2 years from our homes, people are looking into the internet, they're looking into history, they're trying to understand their own background and their own heritage. I see that as a positive. And I think it's good to have the dialogue, and I think it's good to look at collections and chattels and to visit houses and estates and gardens to understand that. Local heritage is very important to us. And I think from a sustainable way, if I could go back to your original question, it's a good question for these great big properties because it is a difficult thing to address. But as Bernard already explained, we look at the holistic approach and how can we present, serve, maintain, restore these properties in a sustainable way. We
Okay.
do that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Chair. And although it's not actually what I'm going to ask about, I should place on record declarations that I co-chair the All-Party Group on Northern Culture and I chair the All-Party Group on Digital Skills, the subjects of which has been a substantial part of this session today, but nothing that I'm going to ask on. Bernard, you praised Nigel Huddleston for being a passionate advocate, and you called him the Tourism Minister. Of course, Nigel was a member of this committee in a previous iteration. But actually, we don't have a Tourism Minister. We have an Under-Secretary of State who is responsible for sport, tourism, heritage and civil society. So tourism is only a tiny bit of what Nigel actually very well looks after, but it couldn't be said that he's a tourism minister. So do you think that government should have a person responsible just for tourism, or should we even have a Secretary of State responsible for tourism? What is your view? And then I would be interested in others' comments.
It's a very good question. Over the years, prior to being at Alva, I was at Visit Britain, so I've dealt with this particular question for about 20 years, so longer than Brideshead. And I don't think there's genuinely a neat answer to this, because the tourism minister in DCM, well, assuming that the tourism minister is located in DCMS, or it could be located in, as it has been in the past, local government or business. Actually, the tourism minister, wherever they're located, has a convening power, because most of the things that affect tourism don't happen in DCMS. They happen in the Home Office or transport or business or local government or wherever. So one of the most important things is that wherever the tourism minister is located and at whatever ministerial level, they have a convening power to bring together the other ministers from across Whitehall and indeed the devolved administrations who can affect tourism policy for the whole of the UK. So one of the best things that happened, and actually it was initiated many years ago now by the then Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Chris Smith, was a interdepartmental tourism industry council, bringing together all ministers from across Whitehall together. That's now actually been reinstituted under this government, and the first departmental meeting of ministers from across Whitehall was chaired by the current Secretary of State just a couple of weeks ago. To more briefly answer your question, I think tourism is the 5th biggest industry, 3rd largest employer, deserves more profile than it gets. I think we've proved ourselves that we are resilient and that we have an importance to the country which isn't just economic, but actually when people were able to leave their homes after lockdown last year, the first places that they went to were gardens and parks and zoos and forests and coasts and stately homes and heritage properties. Now that gives you an indication of not just our economic importance, but the importance that we have to physical and mental well-being too. So I'm always delighted with the current minister that I have, and always want them to shine and be the recipient of more money and political largesse from their masters.
Thank you. Martha, I saw you nodding. Do you want to add to that?
No, I fully support what Bernard has been stating, and would just like to reiterate the importance of tourism for us. And I agree that in a situation of a pandemic, we were able to drive that industry and by the skin of our teeth in most situations, and through entrepreneurialism and finding ways to engage. But Nigel has been exemplary in supporting tourism and heritage and we were delighted when he was reappointed, and would love to see that opportunity, not only in focusing on tourism, but also seeing the Dubois report on DMOs realised, and to see a greater conduit and portal of funding going into tourism.
Thank you. And it's been mentioned here about the issues around government messaging on immigration, and the issues around immigration, and perhaps government messaging on immigration negatively impacting the consumption of British culture. Do you think that's a problem, and do you think that needs to change? Bernard first, and then I'm conscious that we're going to Bernard a lot, so I'm not asking everyone to comment.
Yes. Vocabulary makes a difference, and attitude makes a difference. And I just want to give two particular examples. The first is that there is something called the Nation Brand Index, which is undertaken every year. It's actually undertaken by a British consultant, and it measures the brand of a nation around the world against a number of criteria. And the criteria could be the attractiveness of the countryside, the stability of the government, the stability of the economy, the importance of tourism and heritage culture. There's a number of different criteria. We always do, as the United Kingdom, we always do reasonably well. We're always in the top 5 of brands as a nation. And Visit Britain have got lots of information about this, and I'm sure we'll be happy to provide it to you. Where we've never done particularly well is around welcome. We're seen as an interesting place. We're seen as a fascinating place. We're seen as a country with lots of rich and diverse heritage, but we're not seen as spontaneously warm and welcoming as, for example, and there are distinctions here. The Scottish are seen as more welcoming than the English. The Irish are seen as more welcoming than the whole of the UK. So there are different comparisons here. But vocabulary can make a difference. And I'll just give you as an example, when the Nation Brand Index was undertaken under President Trump of the United States, America's Nation Brand Index plummeted in comparison to when the Nation Brand Index was undertaken for the United States under President Obama, where it soared. Now, that's not because Times Square had changed within that 5-year period, or indeed the Grand Canyon. It was about how that country was perceived. So to answer your point, vocabulary and attitude towards people who live overseas can make a difference to the perception of a nation.
And do you think it is at the moment?
I think it's a constant.
Does anybody else want to comment on that? No? And can I ask all of you, who is it clear, because we've mentioned various departments during the course of this hearing today, is it clear who you need to lobby in government to make changes in policy? Is it clear who, for whatever you're lobbying on, who you go to? Caroline?
I think one of the interesting things that we've seen, partly as a result of the pandemic, is a sort of a cluster of representative groups from our industry. So, BFI, PACT, all coming together around a sort of a central agenda. And I think from our industry perspective, that conversation always feels like it's with DCMS. So I don't think that we ever have conversations within our industry about talking to anybody other than DCMS.
Although if it was relating to immigration, surely that would be a different department. But you wouldn't go to a different department to lobby?
I think immigration is probably not having quite the same impact on our industry as the tourism industry. But yeah, I mean, I think we would definitely see our first line of dialogue always being with DCMS.
And what about you, Martha? What would you?
Yeah, I think in general we do feel that we have a good roadmap to who we need to lobby, other than when there are cabinet changes or alterations and an announcement hasn't been made yet. As before, we were delighted to see Nigel Huddleston back into his seat.
I want to move on to recent sessions that we've had on the government's approach to major events has suggested that there should be much longer term planning and a much longer term strategy for attracting major events. Do you think there's a need for broad underlying strategy to use cultural and heritage assets to promote the UK when we're talking about attracting big events? Bernard?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm delighted that it was one of the recommendations of the Northern Culture report just 3 weeks ago. Absolutely right. And culture and festivals need to be as important and have as high a profile as sporting events or indeed medical conferences. So a number of years ago, I used to chair Visit Manchester, the DMO for Manchester, and we had a very sophisticated event strategy, which made sure that we worked very closely with the universities to enable their students and their lecturers to be ambassadors for us, to attract academic conferences to Manchester. And that worked brilliantly well. I'm really delighted that the government has just strengthened the events industry board and has just added culture and festivals to that board, so that we can see the UK's offer as an event hoster in the round rather than just seeing it through business tourism. I think there's more to do. I think we've often neglected business tourism and event tourism at our peril. And one of the ways that we could get back people, because a great place to visit for work is a great place to visit to stay, and a great place to educate, and a great place to study. So I think the more that we can put financial and political investment, and by political investment I also mean ministers supporting cases, writing big documents, writing ambassadors writing in support of bids to host things in the UK from around the world at our embassies and consulates and high commissions. All of that would be really useful, and I think we're not putting sufficient effort and money into that really important area.
Mm. And Martha, if I could ask you about if there was a major event wanting to engage with Knebworth House and the grounds you have here, how much time would you need to plan that into your programme of events? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? How much time would you need?
I would say the shortest period for a large-scale event would be about 9 months, and in general the lead time tends to be about 2 years. So there is a lot of work that goes into play, both locally as well as nationally. And as before, we would work very closely with our local community and to ensure that the greatest economic stimulation could be derived locally. But we also have to work with transport. We also have to work with visas. And our promoter who's working with us with the Liam Gallagher concert in June is Live Nation. It's an international firm, and there's a lot of play that happens with that, and also how it's broadcast. So as an example, when the previous show, the Oasis event, was relaunched with a film very recently, we saw engagement internationally. We saw billboards in Moscow that were promoting this new film. So there is a lot of interest and there is a lot of engagement that happens with these type of events. And likewise, I'm delighted to see that they're beginning to get greater recognition, both here and other properties within the Historic Houses Association.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Clive Efford.
All being, and the north being portrayed as being dark and grey all the time. Do you think that the locations get a raw deal in the way that sort of humour just trips off the tongue of people who talk about the weather on the news and in our media? Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I mean, no tourist board in the United Kingdom sells Britain as a sunny destination. We sell it as a fascinating destination full of stories and interesting people and amazing pubs and heritage properties and all the rest of it. But we don't sell it on the basis of climate. But micro broadcasting about from radio stations to national networks really does make a difference. And, you know, the odd throwaway comment is, it looks like it's going to be horrible today, best stay in. That affects the bottom line of places like this. And people making a decision when they wake up in the morning, what's the day going to be like? That has the most profound influence on whether people go out and spend their money. I mean, tourist attractions are not fundamentally in competition with each other. Tourism, the competition for the leisure pound and the leisure hour is not between one stately home or a zoo or a museum or a gallery. It's between Netflix and Amazon and B&Q and Sofa. So when you're told by a weather broadcaster, best stay at home today, Britain's fifth biggest industry has just lost out on a contribution to its P&L. So really good insight into meteorological broadcasting would be very good. It's tough, goodness knows. It's tough, but it's not as flippant as people might think. Actually, it has a real impact on the bottom line every day.
I'm glad I gave you that opportunity to get that off your chest.
Very welcome.
Yeah, I shouldn't actually have said Clive Everett there. What I should have said is now the weather. That concludes our session. I wish to thank Caroline Cooper-Charles, Bernard Donoghue, Ralph Lee and Martha Lytton-Cobbold for your evidence today. Order, order.